It came upon her then not as some gentle creeping warmth, but as a conflagration from within, a fierce, internal sun lit behind her eyes, and with its terrible dawning came that familiar agony, the price demanded by the indwelling ghost of logic for its brief and blinding assumption of command. For in that fleeting moment, the quantum calculus engine sutured to the very marrow of her soul, that symbiotic god and devil known as an Eidolon, surged to the zenith of its power, wrestling with the cosmos to glean some truth from the ether. To this searing apotheosis she had long been accustomed, for the covenant had been sealed at the instant of her birth, a shackle of acute power forged within her by unseen hands as she entered the world. Or is it but my own conceit? Came the silent thunder of the Eidolon, not in words as men speak them, but as a current of pure knowing that flooded the channels of her thought, a vast and seamless intuition. That this entire terraqueous sphere, this planetary jungle, bears for us a most particular and calculating malice? And with that terrible query came the deluge, a gnosis that burst the dams of the mundane. The world, which had been but a world, was transfigured. Every leaf upon every bough sharpened into a verdant razor's edge. Every scent that coiled in the humid air became a chapter in a long and savage history. And the very shadows, which had before been mere absences of light, now seemed to confess their profound and ancient secrets. The veil of the mundane was torn asunder, and she was made to see the true and terrible architecture of the world. Couldn't be, she grunted, a sound of bitter irony torn from her throat as she ripped her arm from the tendril of a vine, whose thorns clung with a sentient desperation. I am certain it is a soul grievously misunderstood. Thus did she offer her sardonic prayer into the green abyss. For what was this union within her but a paradox made flesh? She was Lyra, the anima, the human will, the Promethean fire that gave direction to their shared vessel, while the Eidolon, that vast and cold intelligence wired into the fiber of her being, was a god of pure computation, a golem of the quantum foam, a schism, a monstrous marriage of the passionate heart and the indifferent void. They were. And though this fusion lent her a grace that was not of mortal women, allowing her to step with an unnatural precision, yet did they struggle, yet did they toil through this verdant leviathan, this singular brooding will that was the jungle itself, proof that even a demigod may be humbled by the sheer brute fact of a hostile world. At last, through some final act of will, she broke from that suffocating maw and into a clearing, a strange and unsettling calm in the heart of the green hell. And there, like shipwrecked sailors cast upon a desolate shore, were her charges, Dunam and Cadia, ragged and stained from their day's labor in this wilderness. They were the last of her flock on this island, and their fate, like some damnable albatross, was hung about her neck. As she drew near, she perceived the gormless triumphs on their faces, the vacant grins of the unburdened, stiffen and fall into a more rigid cast. To her their souls were laid bare. The Eidolon, with its instantaneous and extramundane divination, translated every twitch of an eye, every subtle shift of posture, into a lexicon of emotion. There it was, a base alloy of excitement and apprehension, of strain, and yes, that inevitable tincture of fear that flavored their every interaction with her. Nor could she condemn them for it. For what was she? A synergist, but a creature of another order? That she was but 19 cycles old mattered not. She was an Icarus of the mind. and in her flight had left the firmament of common humanity so far below that her life was a fortress of terrible isolation, made bearable only by the perfect and monstrous companion fused to her own consciousness. "And what new portent have you wrested from this ground?" she asked, the question gliding on a perfectly engineered artifice of a smile, a calibrated warmth that seemed to coax a genuine beam from each of them in return. And so it was that Kadia, his soul unquiet and his hands seeming over-large and clumsy in her presence, offered up his report as a supplicant might lay a meager offering at the feet of a silent stone-faced oracle. "We cannot say with any certainty what it is," he began, the words struggling forth, as if against some immense pressure. "It presents itself as a fungus, but its aspect is of a bizarre and troubling unreason. It is a thing of profound and awful strangeness." They presented their prize, a fungal body of bizarre aspect, sealed within a glass sarcophagus. Her gaze fell upon it, and the world dissolved. Through the optical augments she wore, the object swelled to fill her vision, and as the Eidolon's computational heart once more became a brief and terrible star, time itself seemed to unmoor from its banks. The frantic, excited chatter of the two explorers slowed to a meaningless drawl, their words stretching into long, thin threads of sound that flew past her heedless senses. For she and her inner god had already plunged into the abyss of the thing, far beyond the shallow soundings of these two men. "Observe," chimed the Eidolon in the silent cathedral of her mind, its thought tinged with the immense and patient condescension of an eternal thing for a mayfly. "Our little beasts of burden have, against all probability, stumbled upon a matter of some consequence." And what a matter it was. The mushroom was a clod of midnight given form, its surface shimmering with an oily, impossible iridescence, like the ghost of a drowned peacock's feather. She saw, with a clarity that was both divine and profane, that the veil beneath its angular cap was torn, a silent testament that its vital dust, its very essence, had already been cast upon the air. In its wretched and alien form there resided a haunting beauty, a dark promise. Then, as the burning ache in her head and spine subsided, and the Eidolon cooled its roaring cores, the great river of time resumed its flow. The two men before her, who had only just seemed to begin their report, were now falling silent. To be forced to listen to them, to witness the plodding, linear march of their discovery, was an agony akin to watching a child attempt to map the heavens with a piece of charcoal. Yet she felt no resentment, only the vast and weary weight of understanding. She was what she was, and they were what they were. With a saintly patience, she allowed their final words to be spent, her mind already sifting through strata of data of which they could not even conceive. "You have done well," she pronounced, the words a benediction and a dismissal. "See that this specimen is catalogued with all due care, as you have been instructed. Then you will join me on the shore. Our labor here for this day is concluded." She bestowed upon them another of her calculated smiles, and watched as the two men, though etched with the day's fatigue, found some new reserve of vigor at the prospect of release. They turned and plunged back into the jungle, their path now leading not toward discovery, but toward the known and finite comfort of their vessel. And so they were gone, and in their leaving, the jungle, which had been but a stage for the small human drama, reclaimed its proper and terrible sovereignty. Upon Lyra descended the full weight of that place, a drenching, suffocating verity of heat and humidity that seemed not an accident of climate, but the very breath of a vast and slumbering organism. It was then, in the sudden and profound stillness, that the Eidolon pushed forth once more into the foreground of her being, not with the cacophony of analysis, but with the phantom whisper of a doubt, a subtle and disquieting resonance that it had detected not in the world, but in the archaic machinery of her own flesh. It was a tremor in the viscera, a vague but insistent premonition concerning the dark fungal prize, now sealed in its glass tomb. Something in Lyra's gut began to stir. A somatic arbitration, the Eidolons thought unspooled, a current of pure logic troubled by a sudden, inexplicable shoal, a judgment rendered not by reason but by the gut. Its presence is undeniable, a signal in the noise of the flesh. And yet, what is its substance? What is its truth? For of all the manifold intricacies of the human animal, whose passions and fears the Eidolon could map as an astronomer maps the predictable courses of the stars, this one thing remained a ghost in the flesh machine. This elusive and unquantifiable instinct, this grim foreknowledge that arose unbidden from the blood and the belly, remained a form of scripture for which its own divine logic possessed no key. Its meaning is obscure, even to me, she thought back, her own consciousness a bridge between the cold, crystalline God within and the ancient animal that was her body. It was a thing of profound oddity, a dissonance in the world's song. We must lay its soul bare upon our return. And with that resolution, she turned her head and sucked from a tube a synthesized draught, an alchemical tincture of electrolytes and minerals, designed to sustain the body's engine against the siege of the elements. It was an act of defiance, a small sacrament of artifice against the overwhelming, organic whole. Her passage back to the shore was no mere retracing of a path, but a battle against a living will. It was as if the jungle, having permitted her entry into its heart, now begrudged her every step of her retreat, as if every thorn was a barb aimed with malice, and every branch a grasping limb of a single, verdant jailer reluctant to release its captive. But after a trial of an hour or more, a struggle that was both physical and metaphysical, she saw it, the sharp and sudden scar where the green Leviathan's dominion met the sterile patience of the sea, and there upon the waters her yacht lay anchored, a floating citadel, an ark of reason against the coming flood. The three of them embarked upon the lesser vessel that bore them from the shore, 3 souls adrift in a sudden heavy silence. In the weary postures of Dunam and Kadia, she read a simple relief, the uncomplicated joy of the laborer whose toil is done. But her own relief was of a different and more shadowed cast, for while they were escaping a place, she was carrying a piece of it with her, not merely the fungus in its jar, but the dark and wordless premonition it had planted in the soil of her soul. And in their shared silence, a chasm lay between them. Their quiet was of exhaustion, but hers was of a terrible and brooding contemplation. As she passed through the irising hatch of her vessel, her ark, her movable kingdom, and into the great bay that housed the shore-boat, she found them assembled, her pets, her company of zealots, all 18 souls of the club, were there arrayed upon the lower deck. She unsealed her helm, and with a weary gesture shook free the long, damp tresses of her hair, which fell about her shoulders like a dark, sea-soaked mantle, and she looked upon them. For what were they, in the final cold calculus of her design, but a many-limbed and passionate instrument? A grand and solemn deceit was the heart of their compact, for she had conjured this fraternity not for the paltry joys of shared enterprise, but as a means to a sovereign end, a way to harness the base ore of their adventurous lusts, and transmute it, through the alchemy of her own will, into the pure gold of purpose. She funded their voyages, provided their bread and their gear, and wore the placid mask of a fellow enthusiast. And for this, they gave her their labor, their passions, their very lives, that through them she might map and catalogue the vast, uncharted soul of the planet Iridian. It was the lonely burden of a monarch to see in the hearts of humans, not brothers or sisters, but tools. "I find myself gladdened to announce," she began, her voice cutting cleanly through the humid air, carrying the placid authority of a commander who has seen the harbor at last, "that our long voyage has found its port. I give my thanks to each of you for your part in this year's expedition. Take your ease now and your rest. The bounty of the vessel is yours. The upper decks are open for your revels. You have earned a reprieve from your labors." 1,000 silent burdens seemed to lift from them at once, and their tired faces broke into weary, grateful smiles. She would grant them this. She had driven them through a great ordeal this past month, and this moment of release was a wage they had been long awaiting. With that, her magnanimous pantomime concluded, she turned her gaze to Kadia, whose hands still cradled the glass cylinder as if it were a holy relic. "You will bring that specimen to my private quarters," she commanded, the warmth evaporating from her tone, leaving only the hard, clear ice of an order. "At once." The Eidolon, ever vigilant, flooded her awareness with the shape of the man's soul, a bitter, resentful flare of thwarted pride. For was it not his discovery? A brief, Promethean defiance. But she gave the thought no air to burn, no time for the man to give it voice. She turned and strode toward the sanctum of her chambers, toward the cleansing ritual of the shower. When she emerged, it was there. The cylinder stood upon her desk like a pillar on a high altar, the black and unholy mushroom suspended in its crystal prison. A consensus was reached between the two minds that constituted her being, the organic and the synthetic, a silent accord that this thing must be approached with a caution bordering on sacred terror. She slid the capsule into a gleaming receptacle beside her console, a mouth that would feed the specimen's essence into the ship's analytical heart. Then she settled her form into the waiting embrace of a great reclining chair, a throne molded to the specific architecture of her body, and felt the familiar, delicate kiss as a fiber-optic tendril found the port at the base of her skull, the umbilicus that bound her mortal flesh to the infinite. The world of bulkheads and filtered air dissolved. It fell away like a shed skin, and in its place was erected the true temple, a virtuality, a noosphere projected directly upon the canvas of her mind. Here the Eidolon assumed its proper form, no longer a mere whisper within her, but a manifest presence, a spectral titan robed in a cloak of shifting star fields and nebulae, its ethereal body a tapestry of galaxies. It was in this placeless place, this chapel outside of time, that they could truly commune. Here, where the sluggishness of speech and flesh were transcended, and the godlike velocity of the Eidolon could be met and matched by the focused will of her own consciousness. They acknowledged one another then, in a manner for which there are no words in any tongue of man, a fusion of knowing, a shared isness, a profound and mutual recognition of the monstrous paradox they embodied. Here, two utterly disparate beings, one born of carbon and contending with death, the other of logic and wrestling with eternity, occupied the same soul, bound by a pact far deeper than mere cybernetics. And as the first torrents of data from the alchemical engine flowed into their sanctum, a vast and terrifying scripture began to manifest around them. A holographic array of impossible geometries and contradictory physics bloomed in the non-space. It was immediately shatteringly apparent that this specimen was a thing of profound abnormality, a cosmic blasphemy, a thing that by all known laws of creation could not and should not exist. But as the logical mind of the Eidolon reeled from the paradox, another older sense arose to meet it. The somatic premonition, that tremor in the gut, returned with the force of a tidal wave. And she knew at last what it was, what the animal in her had been trying to scream all along. It was a warning. It was a raw and primordial fear, dredged up from the oldest, deepest cellars of the soul. The data was now conclusive, a verdict delivered in a language of pure mathematics. This fungus was not merely alien to this world, but to this reality. It was an emissary from some other plane of being, a splinter from a different creation. And then, the true horror. As if their act of observation had been a bell rung in some silent, distant abyss, it became aware of them. It awoke. In that same instant they felt it, not with the ship's sensors, but with the senses of the soul, a deep, intense, and overwhelming surge of energy that came from nowhere and from everywhere at once. Her mind's eye darted to the stellar form of her Eidolon, and she felt its own terrible gaze meet hers. And then, something new, another gaze, a third, had appeared in their sacred two-part union, and it saw them both. What came next was no mere shifting of the mind, but a violent and usurping translocation of the soul. For that third and awful gaze, having announced itself, did not then seek admission, but took it, pouring into the sacred dyadic sanctum of their union, as a tidal wave of filth pours into a bridal chamber. It was a conquest, and the Eidolon, that captured star, that leviathan of logic whose quantum heart was woven through the very fiber of her flesh, gave a silent, burning scream. Its myriad circuits, which had wrestled with the cosmos and plumbed the depths of the void, now flared in a final protesting nova, buckling under a deluge of obscene causation, a maelstrom of alien scripture that was not merely information, but a torrid blasphemy of knowing that forced itself into the deepest vaults of her mind. And in that torrent, that unholy baptism, came the substance of the invader. First, the rage, a rage so pure, so vast and so ancient that it seemed the foundational emotion of some other, failed creation, the blind eternal fury of a flayed titan. And with the rage, nay, within it, came a pestilence of the spirit, a gangrene of being, a metaphysical rot that carried with it the soul stench of a sealed tomb finally breached, the smell of a universe that had long ago died and been left to fester behind the veil of reality. She, the flesh, the anima, the frail vessel for this double damnation, reeled back not in her chair, but in the very seat of her consciousness. Her being recoiled from an abyss that had opened not before her, but within her, and from her throat was torn a sound that was the final and only possible response to such a violation. A scream,